original plan, which was sort of connected to the whole idea of heritage, was to try and source some vegetables that perhaps had links to the heritage varieties. It was just a very initial idea. So because I get a box of vegetables from Growing with Grace delivered to my house, I thought they would be a great place to start. And they're beetroot or something that's like rooty and got big leaves and stuff like that. Bring them back here to the studio and do some paintings. But whilst I was there, they actually said, well, why don't you just come up here and paint under the cover of the glass roofs? Which I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And that's really where the idea came from. So it was a sort of an opportunity really to come out of the studio and almost go into like a different space, which in the end kind of turned into my summer impromptu studio. Very, very pleasant environment because, you know, as people who paint outside, like you're faced with all the sort of, you know, wind or rain or whatever. But that was one of the things that I was like, oh, this is so nice because I can literally just take my stuff and just set myself up. Controlled environment. So, you know, I've sort of created a corner with black fabric and then I could set my still life up. Whereas obviously here, it was just glass over the top of you, really. I mean, you're pretty much in a field. So it was like no control. One day it was, well, actually, you know, it was like bright light, bright sunshine. Yeah, it was insane, the lighting conditions. They were all painted over about 2 or 3 sessions. And I would go back at the same time and start, say, 6 o'clock in the evening. I would paint from 6 till 8. And I did that usually about 2 or 3 times. So that time of the day is also kind of golden hour. And the intensity was even greater. Like sometimes it was a pink sky, and then that would really go. There's some paintings where it's really orangey, and that's really because of that. Glass really mutes a lot of the noise from the outside.
Okay.
But when you're inside, the pollinators, all the bees, the bumblebees, and there's just so many varieties of bees, I lost track. But birds, blackbirds, territorial birds, rabbits, hares, they're not supposed to, well, the hares and rabbits are not supposed to be inside the glass houses, but they're there. But it's, as I was painting, there was just so many bees buzzing around because the windows are all kept open to encourage the pollination, obviously.
Amazing.
So I've kind of gone through a few phases because I took up some classical training overseas. That really sort of steered me down a track, which was different to this. And in a way, it kind of, as amazing as that experience was, I got a bit kind of caught up in that. And so to answer your question, the work that I had been doing was a bit more classical and set up and almost a bit more nostalgic and darker, really. And I feel like I sort of, in that process, in that amazing process of what I did, or in that time when I was training at the academy, it turned off a few buttons, really. And this was sort of me turning back on colour and imagination and just sort of being in the moment a bit more. So I think painting-wise, it's quite gestural and expressive, the way I've painted, whereas in the past, it's all quite sort of, smooth or very controlled, whereas this is a bit more intuitive. There's quite a lot of chaos in even though they're very organized, the greenhouses. Like, one day I would go into the greenhouse and it would just be like wild, because there's been some good weather and it's been watered and stuff. So, like there's quite a lot of chaos, and there'll be times where I just think, crikey, how am I going to make sense of all of this green, so I was thinking, well, first of all, I always go back to the drawing. How's the drawing? And then looking at structure, and I was drawn to the greenhouses because they offer a really nice sort of way into the painting. So these sort of V's and triangles are really, really nice. The structure, I think, is really important because it breaks up from the all the kind of, not chaos, but the wildness of the green. So I think the big thing I remember, those sort of key things that you learn in classical training, but it's sort of like, drawing structure, values. When it's all green and it's all bright and you half close your eyes and you squint and then you just see like shadows and things, and that's so it all feeds back. Yeah. I think with this series, there were sort of two approaches, really, or maybe they started in the same way, but they sort of one went off one way and one went off the other. So this piece here, free and loose sort of view, is almost painted onto like a timber background. So I just primed the timber and then went straight on. So it was all kind of quite quick, really. Made these panels and they're just suitable to paint straight onto. So some of them were timber, some of them I primed a lot of orange or a lot of warmth, even when it's green, like soils and things and bark and vegetation. So I tend to go into putting a warm base down because I like to have a warm ground and then I can cool it down. Very, very thin paint always. And sort of I tend to sort of put my drawing in place. Sometimes it's just in my head, the composition. But then I will start really thin and then slowly build it up so that the paint gets thicker and thicker. So when it was really, really hot, I was able to paint really thin and then sit down and have a cup of tea. And then literally 10, 15 minutes later, it was dry enough to then paint over.
Oh, wow.
But I did also use like drying accelerating things, and some of the paint that I use is like I think it's alkyd, so it's like fast drying. So often I would paint like that, and then some paintings, and for example, this one is just all thick paint, where I just built it up, and that was quite a process of just building that up quite thick. Whereas on the other hand, let it dry, and then I've glazed over the top of this. And the glazing is just a thin layer. So this has to dry first, and then the glaze goes on top. So this is like where it starts to go into a bit more of a different sort of atmosphere in the painting. So I think the other ones that sort of had that freshness and more gestural and expressive, whereas these are starting to get a bit more there's a bit more subtlety, and the glaze is really interesting because I think it unifies a lot of the painting, and then you can go back in and paint more. I like to scumble, and scumble is basically where the way I do it is a dry brush with dry paint. The painting is dry, so these are shafts of light, because I realized that my paintings were getting a bit literal and I needed to bring a bit more atmosphere into them, and there were these amazing bits of light coming in. So once the whole thing was dry, I would then, with a dry brush, bring this dry paint, and it just sort of catches on the tops of the light after the watering, and so there's a bit of a mist. It's almost actually you get these amazing rainbows, which is really nice when it's obviously sunny.
Beautiful.
So so the scumbling is really useful for creating a sort of a bit more atmosphere, as glazing is good for atmosphere as well. Is it a still life or is it a landscape? Because it's sort of really controlled, and in a way, because they were so static, there were just these amazing things that were all, it was a controlled environment in a sense, but there's a lot of machinery and there was a lot of like boxes and things like that, which would be a whole nother thing. I didn't put in were any humans.
It's true.
And I did paint, I did some of my sketches did involve humans, because this whole place is run by volunteers and it's a cooperative community farm, which is amazing. And I was channeling a little bit kind of like that idea of, in realism, in old realism, and it's sort of people carrying out menial tasks and, tilling the land and things like that. And I thought that would be really, really good. But in this case, I decided to focus just literally on the color and the plants and the flowers and the glass. There is a suggestion. There is actually, someone did ask if there was a suggestion of a human here, and I did actually put a human in, and then I took it out.
Isn't it amazing how we can see human, like...
Yeah, I mean, it took me a bit, but yeah.
I had one here as well that I felt like there was somebody inside
the caravan. Yeah.
Gosh, it's closer than it looked in the. But when I look close up, I can't see them anymore.
No.
But from here, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a person. They're wearing a dark top.
Well, there is a chair here for someone to sit on. But yeah, so I did intentionally exclude, but I think it was more just because not the time frame I had, but I think that's a whole nother thing that I would do. I'd underestimated green.
Okay.
Green is quite challenging because there isn't just a prescription green that works. There's so many different greens, and it's the coolness. And actually, I mean, the massive courgette and cucumber leaves and things like that almost reflect the sky off them. So sometimes I'd be looking at them and they were like almost sort of blue on the tops. Yeah, it was like an interesting challenge, but it was sort of trying to make sense really of all the different greens. And it's at the end of the day, it really comes down to kind of the temperature rather than the color. And I think the structure and the drawing to sort of describe it. But at the beginning, I was really struggling with it all looking a bit of a mess. So like the really expressive, I really like painting like this. And really, in a way, this is how it kind of always has been for me with plein air. It's like a fairly quick response, but I do quite like going back and working in the studio and developing them. And so that would probably be how I would like to take them. But I think you have to do. It's a bit like sketching, or a multitude of different collecting of material. And I think the sort of speed at which you paint gives it an energy.
Yep.
And it's finding a way of not, when it's in the studio, sometimes you can lose that energy, whether it be the brush strokes or the immediacy of it. So it's sort of, I think going forward, I'd like to try and sort of merge those two things. So the more expressive and the more methodical and sort of considered, and try and find that middle ground. An idea of almost like a winter series.
Ooh.
More almost like the antithesis of this. Very high up, actually, the location of this, and there's frost and there's snow in winter, and it's wild. And I think in these greenhouses, I went up there last week, and things are dying down, and it's looking, there's that sort of sense of decay almost, not decay, but just drying out and bunkering down for winter. So I think it would be really interesting to, I would like to do a series that's really muted in terms of quite color, an absence of color, and more sort of the calm of winter in a way. I don't know. Nice. Moodiness, a bit more monochromatic, possibly. Exhibition's open until the 30th, and if anyone wants to contact me, they can always come by my website because there's a page there for contact.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Ray.
Bye.
Bye.